We're live. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning if you're in Australia and other parts of the Pacific. I am joined today by the wonderful and prestigious Semiogogue, and we're today going to be discussing the recent events going down between the US, UK, and Australia with a wonderful term AUKUS for some reason. With all that being said, Semiogogue, how are you today?
I'm feeling all raucous on the AUKUS.
All right, well, we just tweeted out that we're live. Mr. AA has given us his wonderful endorsement. So, there he is in the chat. Hello, Mr. Academic Agent. We're hoping to provide you a wonderful breakdown about snubbing the French. So, today is going to be a story, as I channel my inner Semiogogue. Today is going to be a story about the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, China, France, Germany, India, and a variety of organizations both in trade and defense in the Indo-Pacific area. So with that being said, I think it's important for us to start off today with the recent announcement that actually came out of this. So a few days ago, in a joint announcement from Prime Minister Boris Johnson, United States President Joe Biden, and then of course with the Australian government joining right in a joint Zoom call, they all decided to come on in and talk about this new tripartite alliance known as AUKUS on Thursday, under which the initiative would build at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines for the Royal Australian Navy. In doing so, Morrison had also announced the previous agreement that the contract that they had with the French naval group would be terminated in the meantime, causing a significant uproar between the United States and France. Yeah, I know, Frog's mad. But in doing so, the French have been pretty angry in their response. They've recalled their ambassador from the United States, and they've also canceled a few galas in Washington, D.C. as well. And what I love about this was that Biden couldn't remember Prime Minister Morrison's name either, just like I did just a few seconds ago. So he called him that fellow from down under. Just a perfect Americanism for a man who is losing his mind ever so slowly. But with that being said, Semiogogue, any initial thoughts that you have for the reaction to this agreement?
Well, it promises to be interesting. I mean, it's a signal primarily, it seems to me, a strong one, but one that, doesn't change the game board very much in the short term. It's going to take quite some time for them to put however many of these subs there are going to be into the water. So yeah, and there are any number of bilateral security arrangements that the United States has made with countries in the area. And there's what's that old alliance called ANZUS or some other horrible acronym, and there's the Quad, and I believe there's a Quad meeting about to come up, or it's happened already. Isn't there one that's just now about to happen?
It is happening next week.
Right. And so that's short for people who don't know. Certainly Prudentialist does, but the some sort of quadrilateral arrangement, and I believe that's the U.S., Australia, Japan, and India.
Yes.
So there's that to think about, this fact that there are already any number of security agreements that exist that allow for all kinds of cooperation. And this is one that sends a clear signal about, sort of the further development of defense capabilities for Australia. But it's not as though we did not have strong defense relationships already. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Another thing that comes to mind is, you sort of have the Five Eyes arrangement. And, there's been talk for quite some time about sort of reinvivifying CANZUK, or whatever the hell that other horrible acronym is or was, for some sort of reemergence of the Anglosphere. In this case, we just see Australia, the UK, and the United States. So, golly, what happened to Canada and New Zealand? That's so odd. I mean, you could certainly make a strong case for saying, did they really need to be a part of this agreement? Given that it's focused on developing defense capabilities for Australia, particularly nuclear-powered submarines. Australia has been very, very clear about, that they're not going to be carrying nuclear weapons. But that's another thing that comes to mind, where the other two members of the Five Eyes, we're seeing New Zealand say that they won't let these submarines operate in their waters and stuff. And, Canada and New Zealand seem pretty paused relative to Chinese influence, among others, among other degrading sociocultural influences. I have a few other ideas too, some thoughts and notions, but I'll probably be best if I wait for you to set things forth in terms of the general picture, and then maybe just hit them as they come up.
Sounds good. I did want to begin with a bit of humor for today, because there was a MP from Australia that just had the most wonderful take on this recent announcement, and I will read him. His name is Adam Bant, and he had said, "This dangerous nuclear submarines move puts floating Chernobyls in the hearts of Australian cities and their ports. It makes Australia less safe, increases the risk of conflict in our region, and puts us on the firing line. The Greens will fight this tooth and nail." And I cannot help but laugh at just the sheer illiteracy on how a nuclear powered reactor in a submarine like that works. I find that very entertaining.
Yeah, it sounds like you probably should have read that in a Chinese accent. Greens will fight tooth and nail. I don't know. I mean, that's just the kind of squawking that you're naturally going to get from them. So I don't even know if it matters.
No, I just thought that it was very entertaining. But I think one of the major things that we can start off would be the state of Australia geopolitically, because you kind of mentioned it earlier that you were mentioning that sort of the Kanzuk crowd are a bit paused by the Chinese, which is definitely true, especially because with their nearest neighbor, the Kiwis, the New Zealanders, have decided that they're going to work a little closer with the Chinese. And they've offered a indication earlier this year that they were not necessarily going to take themselves any sort of trade war that they've seen their allies like the United States or Australia engage in. She had asserted her country's sovereignty, specifically by staying away from sort of the Anglospheric line or against China, considering how close they've grown. And in terms of that, in April of this year, New Zealand's foreign minister, Nania Mahuta, had said that not all things in regards to New Zealand's sovereignty are going to be pertinent to the Five Eyes agreement. The arrangement, she said, is about security and intelligence framework. It is not necessary all the time on every issue to invoke Five Eyes as your first port of terms of creating a coalition of support around particular issues in the human rights space, end quote. And so you already have a significant, presence of Chinese influence in a growing relationship, although Ardern recently has been on the back foot calling out to the Chinese for human rights abuses. But this is at the same time that, and I hopefully Furious will join us to give us more in depth and detail, is that there has been more pressure against Australia from the Chinese. Recently, in the last few years, there has been commentary very passive-aggressive towards Australia, saying things like that Australia is the gum under the boot of the Chinese when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And they've increased, investments in foreign property, increasing amounts of student visas in the region. So I can understand why this agreement would come up rather recently, especially as Australia begins to feel rather surrounded, so to speak, in terms of the Chinese influence, even as they keep shifting their manufacturing and consumer base closer to India. Keep in mind that India is also a member of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or at least is in talks to be. They've recently they pulled out from the talks, but the same way that they're a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations +6, they're all involved very interconnectedly in economic concerns. So I can understand why Australia would feel the need to resort back to one of its oldest relationships geopolitically, which is that of the Anglosphere.
Yeah, and after this most recent announcement, if I heard things correctly, I think it was in the Global Times, but it was in some Chinese newspaper. They specifically used the old terminology and referred to Australia either directly or obliquely. I can't remember, but they did say that running dogs for the capitalists. Yeah, and there's some talk of Australia looking into missile defense as well. And as far as I understand it, this cooperation um, regarding the development of the submarines is only the first aspect of a number of other things that have been planned as regards defense cooperation. So yeah, it makes sense that Australia would be turning towards certainly the United Kingdom, and with the U.S. being that major power in the Pacific, it makes sense. But we should look at it against the context as well. This is not something new. If some of the people online and some of the videos, I read a few articles, not the same ones that you had pulled, but read a few, and I've watched a couple of these clips on the subject that have come out over the last few days, and people have pointed out that that the United Kingdom has gotten more more independent in asserting its foreign policy relative to how it used to be, at least somewhat more in lockstep with the European Union. So this is a big this is a big sort of foreign policy move on Boris's part, and we have to look at it also against the background of the fact that the UK has been dumping all this money into developing aircraft carriers. I think they had some in the past and then just fell back on Trident submarines. Don't quote me, but
They still
certainly
have their own unique class of aircraft carriers, but much like the French and the Italians, they are nowhere near in comparison to the Americans.
right. But they just built one or two. They
I think
either
they
have
only have
one and
two.
another one's coming. Yeah, well, two are there, and at least one of them is brand spanking new, more or less. So clearly, these things require a lot of advanced planning. So the thought behind increasing the ability of the United Kingdom to project itself navally, that's been going on for some time. And another thing that I would point out about it is if you look at the balance of countries that can field nuclear powered submarines, this tends to, I don't know, this would tend to shift it strongly over into the direction of let's call it the Anglosphere, because at present, if the information I was able to find online is accurate, you've got the UK, you've got the US, China, Russia, India, and France that have nuclear powered subs going. And with India, I think they just have one. Anyway, if these figures are right, they're probably something close to right. The U.S. has 18 Ohio class submarines. Maybe there's some other nuclear powered class that I'm not aware of, but that's 18 Ohio class subs. And then with the UK, you have 6. So that right there gives you 24 nuclear powered submarines. And if you start adding in further submarines coming from Australia, then it would seem to me you're likely going to end up with a balance sheet that has primarily sort of Anglosphere naval power holding the majority of the nuclear powered subs out there in the world. And I should also throw in, well, 2 last things. One is that in going with the United States and the United Kingdom, they of course pulled the rug out from the plans to develop, to the tune of some billions of dollars, a number of diesel electric submarines that France was going to help Australia to develop. And, obviously people have said, oh, the French will be pissed about that. Yes, they are pissed. They were supposed to have that celebration of Franco-American alliance going back to the cooperation, them being our allies and supporters during the American War for Independence, if you like. You mentioned that earlier. But there's another dimension to it. France is one of the 2 sort of core constituent nations of the EU. And so by any level of reckoning, the French helping the Australians to develop their submarine program would have led to, presumably more cooperation between the EU and Australia militarily through France, insofar as they would have their sort of hands in that program. So it's not just France losing the money and the development. It shows a connection with Britain and the US rather than with one of these major EU countries. And I think there was one other thing I was going to mention, right? There were 2 that I said. Oh, the last thing that I wanted to cover, just for people who might not understand, I think most people do, certainly the prudentialist does, The value of a nuclear powered submarine is that it doesn't have to surface and pull in oxygen and do things, or close to surface, using snorkels and periscopes. It doesn't have to come up to pull in air for its batteries and the rest. It can basically stay submerged as long as the crew can survive, in terms of taking on water and food and other supplies. So that's the value of the nuclear powered submarine. It's sort of like, leaving aside space and control of space. It's sort of it's the primary, or one of the primary vehicles for delivery of nuclear deterrence, because it can stay so well hidden. So if you're taking, 18 Ohio class subs in the US, certainly 6 nuclear powered subs from the UK, and adding in some Australian ones, that's a whole lot of firepower. And that some of that firepower coming out of Australia means that it's closer. It doesn't have to come from Guam or whatever. The distances are all vast out that way, but they'll be able to take up a lot of slack and increase the amount of force that this Anglo alliance is able to bring to bear.
Yes, and I think that the point about the French is important to bring up, because this does coincide, I think, recently with a bit of political revenge. I know I mentioned it prior to the stream that Boris Johnson, I'm sure, has no problem doing what he can to sidestep the French after years of French intransigence during the Brexit negotiations. So I'm sure they're absolutely ecstatic about that. But this also, at the same time, comes at a point of unique timing in response to the Chinese, because it's been about almost a month since the disastrous pullout of Afghanistan from American forces, which of course was left with no real consultation between our allies, between Australian forces, UK, and other coalition partners in the country. But what came almost immediately after sort of the fall of Kabul and Afghanistan was that you immediately saw articles from Chinese state officials in Western media and opinion pieces from Chinese state media telling the Taiwanese to give up. That you cannot rely upon the West, that an American promise is worthless. Just watch how they pulled out of Afghanistan. Can you honestly expect them to defend you? And then on top of this, more recently, that has come out of the Chinese government has been opinion pieces from defense officials, as well as the Foreign Office and Ministry, about how the best way to move forward would be to have military drills take over in Taiwanese airspace and begin asserting our sovereignty and begin pushing forward on the one China policy. Now, the issue of Taiwan has always been an interesting one to me, because it's been a matter of politics more so than anything else. The Chinese Communist Party has never recognized the treaty the United States held with Chiang Kai-shek after they fled mainland China. And during the diplomatic normalization during the Nixon administration, between Premier Zhou Enlai and Henry Kissinger, they had made it very clear that a matter of politics makes the Taiwanese question almost impossible with domestic U.S. politics. Henry Kissinger was far more amenable to the Chinese argument about that Taiwan has been a part of China for a millennia. It is technically theirs. We shouldn't let this civil conflict put up for any larger diplomatic or strategic concerns. But Kissinger and Nixon have recognized the anti-communist hardliner position, which makes it almost impossible, to a point where even now, both Democrats and Republicans in the United States are very adamant to support Taiwanese sovereignty in the likelihood that China were to attack. So I find the timing of this agreement very interesting. One, both as a mechanism for the United States to reassure its allies, primarily in the Anglosphere, that they're still going to be able to project power. And then secondly, this is a strong counter signal to the Chinese, especially as they feel more assertive, at least propagandistically. Their naval construction to really assert a defensive posture is still a few years behind. They plan on getting some of their carriers out in 2022. They have made announcements that they wish to have a navy of equal size to that of the United States, but that would take a very long time in terms of manufacturing production, both domestically and getting those resources abroad. And so the timing of this, I think, is incredibly important to keep in time, or at least in mind, excuse me. And on top of that, the fact is that you also have the Japanese to consider. despite the ongoing political issues domestically within Japan, with Prime Minister Suga beginning to step down, which will most likely trigger an election. They have made it very clear, both their deputy foreign defense minister and their foreign minister have said that if China were to take action, that they would defend Taiwan. So you are seeing sort of the battle lines, so to speak, of this great game in the Pacific being drawn.
Yeah, the business of Japan is important, and that ties into the business with the Quad that we mentioned, and we're likely going to hear something that follows on the heels of this first announcement. I would guess, coming out of the news that surrounds whatever happens with this business with the Quad coming up. It's a strange thing to look at the Pacific and think about what the various acts could mean and the rest, the different routes they can take, the Straits of Malacca. Are they going to try to take some route without having to go through the straits there? And, at that point, that's where Australia becomes much more important in terms of the piece on the board strategically, without having to project its power much, because it's just south of all of that, and is in a better position to stick its hands into the pie if people were trying to do things like reroute traffic. Against this background, in addition to talking about Japan, since we're tapping some of these players from the Quad, you've got the it's called, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, I think. I always get the Andaman, something like that. But it's a pair of islands that are kind of positioned well to block or police shipping traffic once it comes out the western end of the Straits of Malacca. The Indians have been doing some work there to build up their naval base and naval presence there. There's talk of missile installations and the rest. And of course, India has been working on subs. It has a number of diesel electrics. As I said, I think it has one nuclear powered submarine. Don't quote me though. I'm not a military hardware specialist in any sense.
They have
so
one.
That's right. And so that's you look at Japan being off the coast, you think about South Korea, you think about Australia, and you take a look at India, and that's a number of countries that are all sort of mixed up. That's the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the ones that are that I was discussing just a moment ago. Probably a larger map would allow people to see their strategic importance relative to navigating around those areas in general for China. I mean, and just background, most people will know this already, but China is a sucking hole for energy. It cannot yet meet its domestic energy needs, and it also needs raw materials to be brought in order to produce the goods that it sells as sort of the junk shop of the world. Although they, increasingly are producing some things that are higher quality. They also need those shipping lanes and to be able to do things at sea to get those goods outwards after they've been manufactured as well. So you got to look at that whole picture with Australia, with South Korea, with Japan, with India. And just to throw it in there, this is just me guessing, but I would not be surprised at all if, as a result of the kind of announcements we saw here with this AUKUS plan, and whatever might come out of what's coming up with the Quad meeting, it would not surprise me at all to see something going on with the Philippines as well, because that's a place where the United States used to have more influence. And it seems to be up in the air in a number of respects. And it's got just an absolutely sort of endless island chain that could also be brought to bear in terms of, alternate routes around this whole area, so that, if China were concerned or the Straits of Malacca were blocked, then these other routes would all become important. That's why I said Australia might become important in some respect there. I'd keep my eyes on the Philippines as well.
The Philippines are going to be incredibly important, in part because the United States relationship with the Philippines has seen recent deterioration, especially under the Trump administration. at the current point in time, there has not been a lot of diplomatic conversation between the United States and the Philippines. At the beginning of Trump's administration, there was a lot of Western comparison to Duterte and Trump about, just that they're these strong man, sort of law and order-esque leaders. When they first initially met, there was rather a genial relationship. But as the push against China from the Trump administration continued, there was a very sudden shift in Filipino policy towards the United States, pushing American forces out, no longer buying American arms, and welcoming the People's Liberation Navy and other military forces of the People's Republic of China in there. Which makes things incredibly interesting, because now that's going to play very much like Semiogogue had mentioned, a important role in what is to come next. And I think that what we'll see in the future is potentially a sort of diplomatic island hopping strategy from the U.S. Between either Kamala Harris or Secretary of State Blinken will most likely be over in Asia very soon to start discussing the implications of what's to come out of this recent AUKUS agreement. The other thing I thought that would be important to sort of understand the state of play in the state in the wake of this announcement would be sort of the presence of where the United States Navy actually is at this time. So let me get this map out. And this one is just sort of to discuss, this is as of the 13th, so of Monday this week, is the fleet deployments within the Pacific. The one that you really want to pay attention to on this map is going to be over here. I zoomed in for you guys. Is the Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group, which is currently just outside of the South China Sea. And the reason why I find that this one is important is that this is one of the more major deployments of the U.S. 7th Fleet, which of course is our largest Pacific presence in this area, and would be the main fighting force if something were to break out between the United States and the Chinese. And where the Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group is very close to where a lot of American interests, both economically and diplomatically, take place. More so diplomatically, because the trade agreements between these various countries do not impact the United States as much as, say, our trade agreements with Japan or Australia. But where its deployment is, I'm going to stop sharing this map, and I'm going to put up another one so you can kind of see which countries we're dealing with, is the fact that the United States is putting itself in a position to sort of reassert its diplomatic and strategic interests in the region. So let's share now the countries that it's where the Carrier Strike Group is.
And just one quick question as you're pulling this up. Does anybody know whether there are UK aircraft carriers in these waters at this time as well? The most recent news I could find was from, that's 15th of September, so that's not too bad. It's a couple days back, and it says that Queen Elizabeth is carrying out flying operations over the Pacific with her jets from 617 Squadron and VMFA 211 of the U.S. Marine Corps. So it'd be interesting. It may well be that there's a UK carrier out that way right now too. Sorry.
Oh no, you're totally fine. In fact, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, according to War on the Rock, says that they're starting a months-long deployment into the region. So they're currently heading to they are in the Indo-Pacific. And one of the things also important to note is that the HMS Queen Elizabeth has its air wing of F-35B Joint Strike Fighters, and it has significant advancements both in its air defense capabilities from comparison to the UK's Type 45 destroyers and its frigate program. So, and as the article notes, that this positioning, of course, and I think Semiogogue sort of mentioned it at the beginning, this move away from sort of the United Kingdom is this global Britain approach, is supported by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So they are currently in the Indo-Pacific area. But in regards to this map, so this is where the Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group is, and they are currently right now in the southernmost part of the South China Sea, or at least where the Chinese claim territory. And throughout the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and I would most assuredly tell you that the Biden administration will be conducting the same sort of maneuvers, is that we do something that is known in international maritime law as a freedom of navigation operation. Essentially, this maritime law allows the free movement of vessels in order to navigate, explore, or just to simply, find their way, which the United States has been doing on a very sort of edging that, very thin line that they carry between espionage and simply skirting the law, to examine Chinese artificial islands within the South China Sea, as well as to keep tabs between the United States and the Chinese Navy, respectively, of their movements. So this is where currently right now the Carl Vinson Strike Group is, and I think it's important to sort of just talk about which countries we're taking a look at now. So you've got Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and of course, right outside, the Philippines, with a long chain of islands, within the Sulu Sea. And then, of course, we've got a variety of islands outside the Gulf of Thailand right below. So strategically, we've seen for a very long time the U.S. 7th Fleet act as a certain counter to Chinese expansion, and more importantly, the sort of iridescent claims that China has made, whether it's the Spratly Islands, as seen right here, and then, of course, more closer to the various issues such as the Paracel Islands and Taiwan, which is right next to it. So there's currently a lot at play here. But the reason why these nations are important and why the American presence is going to tell you a lot about our strategic, but more importantly, our diplomatic interests, is because a majority of these nations are a part of an economic trade group known as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or also known as ASEAN, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is sort of China's free trade agreement in the region with a majority of these countries. And so the United States does not have a particularly long-standing, presence in here. Although when ASEAN meets or they have the Eastern Asian States Conference, the United States is often invited. And but of course, the real question up in the air now is going to be the relationship. Where are they going to move towards? Are they going to be more pressured to rely on American hard power after growing concerns of Chinese expansion? Because you're always worried about what's immediately on your borders, and we can definitely tell what they're right next to, especially for Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, Taiwan, the Philippines. They're seeing an incredibly expansive and constructing Chinese Navy. So that becomes the real question, and they'll be meeting, I believe, later this year with the East Asian States Conference to sort of discuss the general state of economic, political, and strategic affairs in the region. And I think the American presence, alongside this, announcement of a strategic partnership, is trying to illustrate the traditional battle for war or hearts and minds, so to speak, for these smaller states that border China.
Could be. I would also put this against the background of what just happened in Vietnam, because old Anton Chigurh, or whatever, Kamala Harris, the creature, was just off in Vietnam within the last month or thereabouts, and was trying to get a commitment from Vietnam to partner with the United States in order to be able to exert pressure on China in a number of ways. And if I remember correctly, I mean, these aren't the exact words, but basically the Vietnamese told her to go, take a flying fuck at a rolling donut. So she was just over there trying to bring Vietnam in. And in the 70s, Vietnam fought China to a standstill. And Vietnam is, of course, still a communist country, but there are plenty of inroads. Vietnam is a part of that whole economic group you mentioned, ASEAN. And, when I was doing stuff with soft drink companies and I was visiting Bangkok, the regional guy from Vietnam came out, and I got to hear a lot about the markets and the rest. And Western investment is all over it. A lot of the things that used to get manufactured in China are now being manufactured for the West in Vietnam and the rest. But Vietnam basically said, no, we'll sit this one out. You guys sort this on your own time. So the fact that the United States then turned around and went down to Australia may well mean something.
Most likely, and you're probably right there. And it's also important when you mentioned the clashes between the Chinese and the Vietnamese. They're conflict in 79 did bring China to a standstill. It was a border clash. I know that Mr. J. Otto Pole had mentioned in a conversation that we had in a previous stream that the Chinese did not fare very well in that battle. Their ground forces didn't, at least. While I'd imagine that a lot has changed since 1979, because, we're looking back now 40 years ago. But I think it's something that is indicative to say that there's no warm, cordial relations between the two countries, despite having a similar communist background.
Well,
But
I think they're probably warmer now.
well, probably now, especially with the growing trade agreement, which I think brings us to sort of discuss the state of the trade relationship between everyone involved. And I'll bring up another map. This is the uh, Asian map, their association. So let's bring that up. Let me see if I can get a hold of it. There we go. Yeah. So share. So this is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The original partner members are in blue, including Myanmar, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Brunei, Vietnam, Laos, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. But there are also, when including in talks about trade and economic members, you also have Asian +3, which includes South Korea, Japan, China, and then +6, which includes New Zealand, Australia, and India. This is one of the biggest organizations that helps facilitate trade in the South, in the South China Sea, and then other parts of that region. This is a major economic hub, especially for the smaller countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines. This keeps the lifeblood going, and within recent years, especially the last 10, there has been an increased pressure on this organization from the Chinese Navy. They sort of patrol sea routes, manage piracy concerns, and this is a way for China to, of course, exert its influence the same way that, say, the United States does when we're talking about the Strait of Hormuz or the Gulf of Aden in the Middle East when it comes to trading and facilitating, international petro trade. So this map is also incredibly important because this may shape the way that trade is facilitated in the region. Putting the AUKUS agreement into perspective, Australia has been putting a lot more pressure to move a lot of its manufacturing base, or at least its dependency on manufacturing, away from China to India. There was an article that I was reading just earlier today that the way that Australia's policy has been towards China is that their foreign minister had said anytime that there's a question about China, the answer is always towards India. So I would imagine, as the Quad meeting is just happening, next week, literally days from now, that there's going to be a renewed emphasis on the India-Australian relationship. But this, like you had mentioned, will also put increased diplomatic pressure on this region of the original Asian group because even though Kamala was told to leave, and her final middle finger was to go visit the memorial of a guy that bombed, Vietnamese people over 20 times before she left. I think that this will put a renewed pressure and force these countries to sort of draw a battle line similar to what we saw in that old Cold War classification of first, second, and third world.
Yeah, we'll have to see how it shakes out. I tend to think of the Chinese military force still as a paper tiger. I mean, you can point to figures and the size of their army and the rest. I haven't spent like a great deal of time in China, but I got to Shanghai, and I got to see and smell and experience sort of how it all runs there. And obviously they're going to be able to field capable special forces, and they probably got elite military units and the rest, but their Navy is just so recent. They've got a history of mercantilism and sea trade, but a blue water Navy. I mean, I remember in the 90s, geeking out and like reading Stratfor on my break, sucking up George Friedman propaganda. And, they were just beginning to make their movements towards a blue water Navy at that time. And so this is really brand new for them. And there is such a thing as institutional knowledge. That's why Europeans still build the best ships. You can even include Russians in that to some extent, and certainly, the Dutch and the English and the Danes and even the Germans. We've got a long embodied institutional memory of developing and projecting naval power. And a lot of people talk about the United States and how, we're paused and the military's all crap now. It's definitely degrading for sure. But at this point, I just don't see China being all that significant a power. So depending on how the various players on this section of the board get organized, it's that China is very much contained in the sense. You look at this map, you see how India is on one side, you see how Japan and South Korea are there, and we were just trying to get Vietnam on board, and likely just because they didn't offer enough in return. And, given the timing with the pullout of Afghanistan, which just makes us look like imbeciles, that's probably quite a bit of why Vietnam said to hell with all of it. But you can see that Australia is essentially another piece sort of surrounding them and locking it all in. So when you look at these countries coming together, United States, India, Japan, Australia in the Quad, and then the United Kingdom, now with 2 aircraft carriers and doing exercises in the Pacific as well. And then you think about, didn't Germany just run one of its ships through there just to show they could?
They were denied access by the Chinese. They did have their destroyer from the Bayer carrier group, but I was going to talk about that in just a minute. But yes, they were denied port access by the Chinese Navy.
Yeah, well, that's it might be a good time for you to jump to whatever you had next. I just wanted to point out that the idea that China is, some ferocious monster when it comes to its ability to project its military might in terms of naval power, it's just not the case, and that's one of the reasons why they've fallen back on their fleets of merchant vessels where, some captain gets the order from his party superior and they're just like, okay, well, I guess we'll just steer this tanker into this other ship that's pissing us off. They wouldn't have to have recourse to that sort of asymmetrical to employing those sorts of asymmetrical tactics if they were the naval power that they wish they were at this point.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up with your analysis of China being a paper tiger, because a lot of our economic numbers behind China and their growth or their ability to project power, even if those numbers were to be accurate, they have not necessarily recovered, especially from issues they've had domestically within 2019. This is from Doug Chang in the National Interest. This was written about a year ago. And he's talking about how, even Chinese analysts have predicted that they are not going to be dealing with a V-shaped recovery, but rather an L-shaped one. A very long, drawn-out climb out of a hole is more likely, which is why I think we're seeing a renewed economic pressure, especially in the wake of Afghanistan, to focus on investment and trade, because this is giving them the access to the resources they need to keep their economy going. But the article, I thought its big takeaway was that, GDP growth is significantly lower. They've usually seen an average rate of 6.1%. In 2020, it was at 1.3%. If, the article proves correct after what's recently been discussed. But on top of that, I think that it's important that, these forecasts have renewed their pressure, I think, on that sort of warding off and that sort of all bark and no bite attitude that we've recently been seeing, which is why I think there's been that renewed focus on sort of their Belt and Road Initiative, not so much the, oceanic component that comes with it.
And do you know anything about this recent news? I've just seen, mutterings and splutterings about it in the background, but the business with their real estate sector having some problems. Isn't there something going on with that as well? Or does anybody in the chat know? Signs of their impending demise, have increased or whatever.
I'm not particularly too worried. Well, I don't know. I do know that there are worries. I know the Wall Street Journal had an article the other day saying that their real estate loans are not doing well. They're considered non-performing. and they are on a rise in Chinese banks, which shows a likely bubble to be popped soon. But that's the extent of what I know. Someone in the chat is mentioning Evergrande might default, and the second largest real estate developer.
Right, and there's the business with a whole bunch of major, a huge high-rise development that was just bulldozed or demolished because they'd been built like 12 years ago or something. And
Oh yeah,
you
they're
know,
ghost cities.
from a satellite view, they just tore them down. It may well be. I would expect that what's happening is they've got some sort of real estate blowout, and it's not a bubble that's about to pop. It's probably a bubble that it has been popping, and they just can't hide it anymore. It'd be my guess, because I also recall when I was talking with Tim about things going on in China, you had all that business with those fake gold bars that were on deposit, and they just didn't even have the money. You know, so it's they're having real problems.
Yeah, a lot of what the chat is saying is that they're seeing a pop very similar in progress to what happened in 2008. And Sean Wineland is telling us that a lot of the buildings that they just destroyed were never suitable for habitation to begin with, which kind of reminds me of all of those wonderful jokes about Paul Krugman and GDP. So I find that kind of entertaining, that they're just simply making things to give up that perspective, which I think reinforces the idea that they're a paper tiger anyway. Something that I've discussed on streams about China in the past has been that sort of the intentus, so to speak, of what China's strategy is towards the United States is to, help politically and economically put a strain on the U.S. to where you can sort of accelerate the ongoing domestic tensions. That way you can kind of secure what you need to do without firing a shot. But clearly, I don't think that they're going to succeed in that avenue, in part because of this recent agreement with AUKUS and the increased diplomatic pressure. And I mean, Quad is meeting in literally days. So I think that strategy is not going to play out the way it did. But before we move on to the Germany thing, I kind of had to chuckle when you mentioned that you were listening to Strat 4 on your off time, because literally the thing that got me suckered into geopolitics when I was younger was picking up a copy on a whim, George Friedman's book, The Next 100 Years, in 2009. And ever since, this stuff has always fascinated me. So I just thought that was a little fun to talk about.
Yeah, back when the bombing of Belgrade was going on, they made their name by getting the intelligence about how the Chinese embassy had been hit, and I was like, just somebody sort of handed that to them on a platter to be this, to draw attention on the internet. This was probably like 1997 or 98, whenever that happened. Apostolic Majesty would scoff at my inability to retain dates, but yeah, that's when I began looking at it too, back in the 90s, and then I was like, wait a minute, I remember that they predicted quite firmly that the Middle East would remain, just a quiet backwater for the foreseeable future. And of course, within 10 years or so, that was no longer the case. So whatever.
Yeah, some of their predictions are great. They predict a war between the U.S. and Mexico by the end of the century, and that Poland is going to be a superpower by the middle of the century. So who knows? We'll see how crazy things get.
Soon, Poland too will be world power.
Well, Poland can get into space, but we'll see. But on to the European parties involved. So on the 16th, the German Foreign Ministry spokesperson had said that Germany had denied a German warship on a mission to the contested South China Sea entry into a harbor. The ship involved is the frigate Bayern. The spokesperson said in a news briefing, but did not identify the Chinese harbor. The vessel had set sail from Germany earlier this year to carry out a 6-month mission to the South China Sea. The German Foreign Ministry spokesperson had said China has decided that it does not want a harbor visit, and we took notice of that. China's foreign ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian was asked about the incident and said that the Chinese hoped that countries outside of the region would play a constructive role and respect regional countries' efforts to maintain peace and stability. Quote, China attaches great importance to the development of an all-around strategic partnership between China and Germany, including cooperation between the two militaries. And that's pretty much more or less his only statement about this. So I do find it interesting that this is in context between the AUKUS agreement and then Germany, because as we've seen recently, starting in the Trump administration and continued by the Biden admin, is that the United States does not sort of have the same economic or diplomatic pull that it once had in regards to sort of getting the Western part of the world, that sort of liberal hegemonic view of the world, under its, under the same sheet of music, so to speak, to a point where really it's the Anglosphere that is denying the sort of Chinese telecom giants from, investing in infrastructure in there. I know that the UK and Australia have said no and have banned Huawei in the area. Brazil as well, of all countries. Whereas Germany and other parts of Europe, France especially, have been more receptive to Chinese investment in the telecom sector.
France has been more receptive to Chinese telecom investment. And they just got their little wee-wee smacked as regards billions of dollars of business in Australia. Yeah, I think that the talk about, going it alone and all the rest, I mean, this is sort of a, how do I say this? The business of Brexit, depending on which way it goes, and which way all of this goes, because in many respects it looks about as black and miserable as you can imagine. But we are seeing now something going on with the United Kingdom, Australia, and the US asserting themselves. Again, New Zealand and Canada oddly left out. So funny. We're seeing basically how this Anglo grouping, this Anglosphere grouping, is showing that in and of itself, if it wants to, it is capable of, as much force projection as is required at this point. I mean, if you have 8 Trident submarines and 2 aircraft carriers groups rolling out of the United Kingdom, and you've got, God knows what the United States is able to field. I saw in the chat that someone more knowledgeable about it was pointing out that Ohio class subs are not the only nuclear powered submarines. So, obviously I have my limitations in forming a proper picture or sharing one of the ability of the U.S. to project naval power. But when you put Australia into the mix with its own coming fleet, we're given to understand, of nuclear powered subs, it seems that the importance of being able to pull these other allies in is quite a bit less. I mean, think about the business of the French and how they were going to build those subs for the Australians, and how that would have connected at least that aspect of Australian military force projection through submarines to France. To a certain extent, France would be able to at least exert some kind of power, saying, well, we don't feel like it's best if you do this. And if you want to have our continuing support for your fleet of submarines that we helped you develop, it'd be best if you just kind of go our way on this one. And so it's not just cutting France out of the picture in terms of making that money. As I said before, it's moving France, and with it, perhaps to some extent, EU wishes to the side, and showing, well, wait a minute, now we're going to have Australia as a part of this thing unfolding in the Pacific, whatever the hell all of this is.
Yeah, and I mean, adding Australia and the United Kingdom's naval presence in there on top of the US 7th Fleet that is already deployed, consisting of around 70 ships and submarines, over 150 aircraft, and 20,000 sailors and Marines that could be rapidly deployed. And they've recently had an exchange of command. So, I mean, there is a lot that just, puts its presence on there. But I think that the France getting its wee smacked, so to speak, is also sort of a sign of the underlying European tensions that I think bubble over into international affairs. If we're going to invoke George Friedman again, he did write a really good book at the beginning of 2016 called Flashpoints, The Emerging Crisis in Europe, where he sort of makes the argument that the EU is not long for this world, which I think remains to be seen. But one of the more better arguments that he makes in the book was that some of the recent political and economic events in the Western world, specifically the Russian invasion of Georgia, but most importantly, the financial crisis, has started to bring back all the European rivalries up into the fold. And one of them that he mentions is, of course, the ever so wonderful, Franco-Anglo rivalry. And so I think that we're sort of seeing the UK try to reassert itself as a global Britain. And in doing so, they're happily ready to limit French ambitions because, as we've seen during the Trump administration, both Germany and France simultaneously telling themselves that it's okay, Trump won't be here for long, but at the same time, we need to do more to assert ourselves on the international stage and not be so dependent upon the Western world, or specifically the United States. So it does put us into an interesting state of affairs. But while we're at it, Furious has managed to just join us, so let me go add him to the stream. Welcome.
It's about damn time. Where's our AUKUS? We needed an AUKUS.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for my my tiredness and B, my technical problems. I've literally been sitting here 20 minutes trying to get my audio working. So sorry about that. And thank you for having me.
Well, welcome. We needed to have someone from Australia definitely give us their perspective on what they make of this, because we can only say so much as a bunch of members below the Mason-Dixon line in the U.S.
Oh, well, at least you're on the correct side of the Mason-Dixon line. But yes, it's been an interesting issue that's brewed up here. I actually didn't even remotely realize that this contract was being, shall I say, in any way amended or
I think we lost. Oh, there you go.
You're cutting in and out. Okay. Like I said to you, I'm not too sure if the satellite would work, but
you cut off at the point where you had mentioned that the contract had been amended, but we lost it after that.
Okay. Just keep going, Prude. I'll work this out in a sec.
No worries. But yeah, so this is, I think, really bringing back some of those European rivalries as well. I mean, especially the post-war world in the West has kind of always had that continental island divide. And I think that the United States also plays a major role in that factor, especially as the U.S. has had both the Trump administration and now Biden sort of continuing this sort of staunch policy towards China, but at the same time being rather supportive of the UK in trying to assert its ambitions, whether that's in trade negotiations or, of course, more recently, as we've seen here, this AUKUS deal with Boris Johnson pushing this, global Britain and reasserting itself on the world stage, which includes, increased naval construction. Although that can be in question, as there are issues, of course, with Scotland as well, because of nuclear production and where they house some of their Trident nuclear-based submarines. But hopefully that won't have a problem there with the UK and their ability to project power. But as the Indian Express was reporting today, as we're sort of talking about the Quad and these relationships primarily between Anglo-influenced countries, India has been apprised by Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia. They made them aware of what's to come, but they don't necessarily know the details. But what comes from that I find most interesting is, what is India to do? India is a member of the regional cooperation, economic partnership, China's free trade agreement, which really stands in terms of its economic production to be not very contributive. Like, it doesn't have much to contribute to sort of China's GDP, to where even Asiatic economists have said that this would only improve China's economy to something that would be akin to a rounding error. So it's more so for political influence, I think, in the area, which India is been pulled away, but China has been increasing political pressure for them to join this organization. They sort of pulled out of the talks at the last minute, and so this organization is only really 10 months old. This traded partnership between various countries. India not being one of them, I should be clear. However, there are a lot of pressure to get them in there. The countries it does include as signatory countries includes, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, Laos, Malaysia, New Zealand, and the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Singapore. So despite their efforts to get India in there, I think that it shows that their diplomacy efforts towards India is not necessarily succeeding, especially as the Quad is coming to meet in a few days.
And what is this economic arrangement that gathers up all these various states that you just named? When was that finalized?
November of last year, so 10 months ago. Although it had been in discussion since 2011.
Okay. Yeah, it depends on how they've changed it out. Under Trump, obviously there was a good relationship with Modi. And I would guess that part of the reason that India is staying out of it, this is me just guessing. So, if anybody knows more, please correct me. But I would assume that in attempting to form some sort of multinational trade partnership, they brought in all kinds of regulations and, controls on how things get done that, as is usually the case with such agreements, are designed to push everybody into the positions that the great powers want them in. And it may well be that with the change of administration and Modi not getting along with Biden as well, that he opted out for that reason.
Yeah, Biden has put more pressure on towards the sort of liberal hegemony that is often seen by the American foreign policy establishment that has been around for quite some time now, since the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Barry Posen, who's a well-known foreign affairs writer and international relations scholar, as well as a prominent realist, recently wrote that the United States needs to start treating its alliances like traditional alliances rather than just avenues to exert its values or its ideology. The Diplomat was discussing earlier this year about the American and Indian relations under Biden, and there's going to be tensions between Biden and Modi, especially because Biden is more emphatic on things like democracy, human rights, and climate change agreements, whereas India is trying to rapidly industrialize and sort of become a more modern power, especially as it deals with concerns about China to its northeast, and then, of course, its more immediate concern, which is Pakistan to the west.
Oh, and the return of the Pertinax.
Okay, how's this? Is a latency better on this?
Perfect. You sound
Okay,
a lot
good.
better.
All right, excellent. All right, boys. Yeah, so keep going through, and I'll jump in where necessary. If you want to keep going on that monologue.
Well, I was wondering how. What's your perspective on this, just in general? Now that we've got you here, what is your take on the AUKUS agreement in general?
Well, I suppose from a purely sort of Anglo standpoint, it's probably the contract that should have always been. I don't know if you've got to details yet on the technical aspects of the submarines and what have you, but the submarines which we were going to get built secondhand by the French were basically a nuclear submarine which was sort of counter retrofitted to take diesel engines, because Australia has a very awkward attitude towards nuclear power. Essentially, we just don't have any. Well, we have a test reactor, I think, in New South Wales, but we essentially don't utilize nuclear power, despite being, I think, the country with the second largest deposits of uranium. We basically export uranium to a lot of countries around the world. So we haven't had any vessels that have nuclear power. These new subs would be a groundbreaking in that respect. These new ones we're getting from via the AUKUS agreement. However, I guess we're entering that quandary of the setback that nations suffer when, shall I say, civilians control the military and they make decisions based upon electors and constituents, because the main thrust of rather the political considerations for the previous treaty the previous agreement we had with the French was to have these. I think they were going to be primarily built in South Australia, where we actually have sort of naval shipyards, and then they're going to be maintained, I think, in some of the subs are going to be maintained in Perth, which is on the west coast, and then on the east coast, I think possibly Brisbane or Sydney. I can't exactly remember where. So that was the thought process behind that agreement with the French, but we would essentially have to maintain our present submarine fleet for at least another 25 years before we took deliveries. And chances are that the sub-technology we would have acquired would have already been out of date, essentially, by the time we got our hands on it. Whereas I actually haven't read through the AUKUS treaty entirely, but I believe delivery is going to be on a 20-year shorter schedule with the agreement that's just been made now. What I would say is that I think it's been highly irresponsible of the government to have angered the French, and it has made us look like a partner in bad faith. And like I said, it was an agreement basically stitched up prior to an election to placate concerns regarding naval military construction and maintaining jobs in Australia. And when a nation makes those kind of defence decisions based upon the whims of electors and in the context of an election, it's just an eminently bad idea.
And can I ask a quick question, Furious? And may I,
Sure.
Prudentialist, just a quick one in terms of how the Australian military, generally speaking, both land and naval forces, Air Force, the rest, in terms of how they're armed and equipped, do any particular nations stand out? Like, so we're hearing about the French in terms of this agreement with the submarines, but what about fighter jets and all the rest of armored personnel carriers, et cetera, et cetera? But is there some sort of major defense industry trade going on between, for example, Australia and France that would be hurt beyond the business with the submarines? And is it possible that we could just see the United States moving in more fully to provide even more in terms of weapons and fill up its coffers? Or what is the picture there?
Well, to my knowledge, certainly in recent history, we haven't really utilized anything sort of a French background in terms of whether small arms or armored fighting vehicles, anything like that. What is true, though, is there has been a gradual Americanization or a stronger orientation towards Americanization of our forces in from a materiel context. So, pardon me for a second. We used to operate the Leopard 2 tank in Australia up until, I think, around 2000, sort of around the time of the Afghanistan-Iraq wars. We switched over to using the Abrams tank. There was a phase of a period, but I believe that crossover has been completed, or it's nearly completed. Also, Australia threw everything into the Joint Strike Fighter project. Which was, how shall I say, a little bit fraught, because we still, I'm sure you guys know more about that even than what I do, but the Joint Strike Fighter project has been another one of those military industrial.
Yeah, no. Oh, no. Well, what I can say about the Joint Strike Fighter program, to continue on from where he was going, was that Australia is a Tier 3 partner in the Joint Strike Fighter F-35 program. They signed on to procure originally 100 F-35 strike fighters in 2002. Then roughly that reporting had changed around 2008 to get 75. However, the Royal Australian Air Force has also been pursuing a more amphibious perspective towards their military. They have been recently constructing what are known as Canberra-class landing helicopter docks, which would not only allow them to, have amphibious landing craft and helicopters for troop deployment, but it would allow them as well to put their military out in rapid deployment. They currently have 2 built, but there are talks to both replace them and put them out in the future. So, as Furious was saying, as I add him back in just now, there has been a substantial amount of Americanization of the Australian military, although there has been concerns about whether or not that is effective with Australia's own interests and its relationship with other countries.
And just a quick thing, I pulled up the list of Australia equipment of the Australian Army, and there's the M1 Abrams, produced by the U.S. There's some combat reconnaissance vehicles from Canada, Germany, Netherlands, a lot of stuff from the U.S., Bushmasters and Hawkeye PMVs or whatever produced in Australia, some of the trucks from Germany. And what else here? Sweden seems to provide some stuff for man pads, and UK for howitzers. France does, though, appear to be supplying these Airbus Tiger helicopters. France also seems to be providing Taipan or MRH-90s. France also Eurocopter.
So
Norway
the Army aviation sort of elements, helicopter elements. Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, and that's the only place where I'm seeing it, though. But you can see that would be a way for the EU to kind of have its hand still in sales in that respect. So perhaps that will change.
If we're talking about Europe as a monolith, though, Australia has had relatively extensive links with Germany as well. For instance, our main combat rifle is essentially a derivative of the Austrian Steyr, and I mentioned before, the Abrams, we were using the Leopard too, so we have had quite strong historical ties with German industry. So yeah, that's a good point, Semiogogue. It just depends, I suppose, whether that European link is soured by the French experience or whether the Germans maintain more cordial terms.
Yeah, and one last piece I just sort of wanted to throw out there for you guys to chew on the chat to respond on or whatever. It just seems to me the more we talk about this, the point about Britain sort of doing its own thing in terms of foreign policy now as, a first major foreign policy move on the part of Johnson since Brexit in terms of this cooperation with the United States and Australia to produce submarines, and Prudentialist was talking about this as well, sort of going its own road. And, the point got brought up, are we now at a point where the Anglosphere, so to speak, can do everything it needs to do internationally as sort of an echo of the historical, British Empire and the Commonwealth countries? Is the Anglosphere at a point now where it doesn't need Europe to buy in any way? And especially when you're talking about things that are happening outside the scope of NATO, potentially, or, sort of in an overlapping but separate realm. And when you think about that, when you consider those options and possibilities and the fact that we had the Kanzuk stuff being talked about in the background and various defense pacts and the rest, and when you talk about things like the Five Eyes, it just seems to scream to me, and I wanted to turn it over to y'all and see what you think. It seems to scream to me that after a certain point, whatever the infiltrations of Globo Homo or the Chinese or the rest, however you want to characterize it, however much they may have already seemed to have wormed their way in already, because of what we're talking about here, the ability of the Anglosphere to project its force abroad and to cooperate without requiring Europe to sign on, or Russia really to sign on. And with the Pacific becoming a more important theater, it just seems to me that there's no way that the crap that is going on in Canada and the crap that is going on in New Zealand is going to be allowed to continue. Not the worst of it. Like, I just, maybe I'm wrong, and I'm already probably mocked for being an optimist, but I just don't see Ardern lasting in New Zealand. I don't see what's his name, the bong smoking drama teacher in that country north of us where everybody talks funny. I don't see that lasting if things are going to continue to go the way that they look like they're going, just in terms of the military partnerships and the strategy, because there's too much of a weak link if China is allowed to chisel off Canada and New Zealand any further than it already has done, which is quite considerable.
Well, and there we go. We can add him back in now. But to answer, that is a lot to chew on there, because I do follow, and he's gone again, but I do follow a lot of what the Canadians in their upcoming election. It does look like that, best case scenario, it ends up with some sort of coalition, Conservative Party of Canada, minority government, but it seems to be that Trudeau may just survive. I can't speak too much about the current state of affairs in New Zealand. I do know that Ardern has got quite the mandate, and she seems to be doing well, especially politically, in her response to the coup. But I'm not too sure though that you can sort of disregard. No, I'm not saying that your point was that we're going to disregard NATO or anything. But if the so-called Anglosphere is going to keep moving in the direction that it is, I think that the United States, especially, may begin to look at things in a two-tier sort of system. There is still this Anglospheric, Anglocentric view of how to conduct foreign policy. We have the quote unquote special relationship with the UK. Although I'm sure the UK doesn't view the special relationship as taking care of a special person in the White House, but I would view that the United States would probably take it as a two-tier approach, because you can probably safely rely on Anglosphere countries like the UK and Australia. But the internal problem of China would probably force you to limit your interaction or intelligence sharing with Canada or New Zealand, especially right now, right in the United States. There was just that spokesperson, I forget which university in California, I think it was Stanford, saying, please, there's no need to investigate Stanford for Chinese spies, even though we've got a lot of Chinese money flowing through Stanford. So please stop the investigation. So there is definitely a strange response, I think, to the ongoing question of China. I think that it's safe to rely on the Anglosphere historically. But again, the United States will have to rely on NATO, especially because its interests in sort of the eastern part of Europe is not going away. Poland is increasing a demand in American investment in arms and its presence there. Trump was going to have a new military base for Americans to be stationed in Poland. I'm sure that's still continuing. So there's a lot going on, and I think we're providing a very technological response, show of force, so to speak, to the position of China. But based on your recommendation, Semiogogue, about unrestricted warfare from that 1999 publication, I don't know how well we're effectively countering other forms of subversion.
Well, yeah, there's all sorts of problems with that. I do want to qualify. I'm talking mostly about this business with the Pacific,
Okay.
and possibly with the Arctic and Antarctic. I think obviously NATO is going to be important in Europe, and it's also going to be very, very important in Africa. Based on what was that guy's whatever his name was, with the vertical arrangements on the map for strategic blocks. Europe and Africa have always sort of been linked. And as we've seen, there are so many politicians in Europe and non-governmental organizations that want to make Europe and Africa one thing. Jules Roy, I am not talking about Francophone Canadians. You guys speak just fine. It's the other ones who say flag that I have no time for. Rather than flag. But anyway, the point is that I think it has more to do with the Pacific and the issues there at present. We get some sort of weak ass German, a destroyer that tries to navigate through those waters, and then they're informed they shouldn't, and they say, well, we understood, we're informed we shouldn't, so we'll just go back away again. It was just totally like a gimme. They just threw it at the wall to see if it would stick, to be able to say that they participated with it. And now we're seeing that the UK is doing exercises there, is busy building aircraft carriers, is cooperating with the US to do it with Australia. If nothing else, I would think that there's just a certain amount of time that the stuff is going to be allowed to continue on with New Zealand, in terms of it being further and further subverted by the Chinese, if for no other reason than the fact that it seems likely New Zealand is shortly going to make a major play for continental shelf resources on the seafloor. And to whatever extent that New Zealand is successful in that, it's going to become the steward of a vast amount of energy and mineral wealth. And that's going to be another place where the Chinese are going to come crawling, like Greenland, like the Arctic, So if nothing else, I would say that the days of what's going on in New Zealand are numbered. I'm not saying it's going to immediately turn, lots and lots better. It might just be that the pause is coming from a different direction. But it seems to me the writing is on the wall for Ardern. And that if you say that she's got a great deal of support there, I guess so, because, I shouldn't be surprised to whatever extent anyone in the European diaspora can be cucked. But whatever polls come out to indicate that she's super popular and everything, we know where those polls come from. We know how reliable they are, which is to say, I'd probably get to like the fourth or fifth page of one of them printed out before my ass was clean.
Well, on the point of the Arctic, I did a stream not too long. Well, I can't say not too long ago. It was like 3 months ago. It was before the surgery, talking about the Arctic Circle and the parties involved. And the major party that has the advantage in the Arctic Circle, even though China, Scandinavian countries, and the United States and Canada all have interested claims in that area, Russia has like the de facto technological supremacy. They're the only ones with a nuclear-powered icebreaker fleet. The United States barely has
we have a couple.
We have a handful of icebreakers, but they're diesel-powered. And we've got, I think, one existing nuclear-powered icebreaker in comparison to Russia's 5, and there are like 6 more on the way, if I recall correctly. I did a whole stream on that, so I would recommend the chat take a look at that if they're interested in Arctic affairs. But I think that you have a really good point. That I think that the flirtation with a Five Eyes country like New Zealand with China will probably go on for so long before the U.S. or the U.K. Put their foot down. In fact, one of the biggest things that came out of this AUKUS agreement was that what really had the conversation started was, the G7 summit held in the UK in June, because, Australia was looking, the article from Defense News from today says the change to a nuclear-powered boat in lieu of the conventional submarine Australia was designing in conjunction with the Naval Group and Lockheed Martin Australia for its combat systems was made as a result between a meeting of the 3 leaders in the G7 summit held in June, during which the AUKUS alliance concept was formulated. The decision is understood to have been brought about by a deteriorating security environment and rapidly evolving military technologies in the Indo-Pacific region, and enabled by new technology which allows Australia to build nuclear-powered boats that do not require supporting a civil nuclear industry. Which I think is telling because the French naval group stuff that they were going to put out, despite its delays, I think that the earliest that they were going to be coming out was around the late 2025 to 2030 time range. And by then, that technology was most likely going to be considered obsolete, especially as we talked about at the beginning of the stream, the disadvantages that diesel-powered subs have compared to nuclear-powered ones.
Yeah, I'd also be interested to look at what's going on with well, we can see if Furious's audio is coming through.
Furious, are you good?
Yeah, sorry. My driver's had an absolute spastic attack, so I'm back now. But keep going, Semiogogue. I'll jump in after you.
Put a new dingo in the dingo net.
No,
yeah. Now I'm trying to remember what the hell was I just saying, Prudentialist?
You were about to start talking about, I believe, both technology, but I know that you had originally asked both me and Furious our perspective on arms and what's to come next in the area.
Right. But one thing I just wanted to point out is I would be looking at what's going on with deals for uranium, because even if they're not going to have their domestic, nuclear energy arrangement, and they seem to be just as against that on paper, certainly, and publicly, the attitude seems to reflect it. They seem to be against nuclear power in Australia. They also seem to be against nuclear weapons, certainly. But I know that there's a considerable amount of uranium in Australia. So I'd be interested to look if some deal got cut on one side for that. I mean, if they're going to be developing nuclear powered submarines there and they have their own domestic uranium, that would be an interesting thing to look at. But let me stop talking since, Furious arrived.
I do know, Semiogogue, that there is a deal about Australian domestic uranium trade between India and Australia that came out in 2014. But since Australia's wonky nuclear policies came out, I think in the 90s, was that they wouldn't do any sort of trade of nuclear materials unless there was a non-proliferation treaty signatory being the trade partner.
I wonder if you could get around that by needing your own fuel that you could use domestically, but it's on the military. It's for the military program. You see what I'm saying? This could be a stalking horse allowing for either domestic mining, acquisition of the material or processing of some respect. Because I mean, the bottom line is this is much like everybody complains about with Iran. From China's perspective, once Australia has a nuclear submarine, it's as simple as taking a missile with a nuclear warhead and just dropping it into one of the conventional launch tubes on the submarine. So if you're talking about like getting yourself right up to the edge of being able to do things with nuclear weapons, all that would have to happen if something were going down would be that the United States turned over X number of, nuclear warhead missiles to arm the submarines, and Bob's your uncle.
Yeah, well, it's really a case of to what degree does this new treaty act as an extension of America's nuclear capabilities, I suppose, because, like you say, it's easy enough to once it's easy enough to retrofit into the weaponry in that regard, because we don't have, to public knowledge, we don't have atomic weaponry on Australian soil, but if it onto a submarine has relatively sophisticated and long range capabilities, well then that dynamic in that question changes rather considerably.
I know that from the announcement, Morrison had made it very clear that there wasn't going to be nuclear weapons. There would be just nuclear-powered submarines in a way that was done that didn't require a lot of, on-site production or, reliance on Australia's own nuclear energy or production capabilities due to their policies and getting around that. I know that in the announcement that there was going to be a considerable transfer of American-made Tomahawk missiles to the Australians, and that would be their primary source of armament along with other carrier killer-like weapons. So
exactly.
I don't think it tips the balance of power in terms of nuclear deterrence. Although
I was speaking purely in theory, by the way. Sorry,
of course.
Mean that as a,
no, you're good. I know that also in theory that plenty of realist foreign policy scholars have been advocating to just give Australia and Japan and South Korea nuclear weapons, and Bob's your uncle for the United States just to get the hell out of there.
Well, it would be the strongest deterrent in that sort of context, because then you sort of enter sort of mad territory, right? Mutually assured destruction. But I feel that policy is a policy which would not be strongly supported in Australia, considering how tenuous our tepid attitude towards atomic energy is, broadly speaking here. What I would say is that one aspect, and this isn't purely military, this is obviously more of a trade consideration, but north of us is the Straits of Malacca, which passes between Singapore and Malaysia, the Malaysian archipelago. And north of Australia lies Indonesia, which is the world's largest Islamic country. And then, of course, north of that, you have China. So there's a lot of that maritime traffic and a rather complicated, shall I say, sort of demographic and strategic scenario that sort of is brewing north of Australian shores, which it's safe to say that this submarine treaty is, or the submarine deal rather, is a part of that puzzle, so to speak.
Well, I wanted to pick both of your brains on this issue because as this is a response primarily because China was name-checked twice in this announcement between Johnson, Biden, and Morrison. Do you view this more so as an offensive or perhaps an aggressive posture, or is this maybe a defensive response?
In terms of Australia specifically, say of our own, I would say we probably view this as a purely defensive measure. I mean, I believe the deal for 8 subs isn't a particularly large force, and you're not going to really partake in anything offensive on that basis. And just Australia being the kind of nation we are, I don't think we really have offensive mind. I mean, the only activity where the Australian army is really being deployed sans Afghanistan and Iraq, which was sort of American-led things. The only thing Australia's done in the last, really since the Vietnam War, has been an intervention in East Timor on behalf of the Timorese breaking away from Indonesia. But that East Timorese thing, as an aside, Australia hasn't done anything that you could technically term offensive in the region. And so I think this is considered more of a defensive thing if we're taking into account just Australia. But if you're talking about the American context, I don't want to speak on behalf of you guys and your country, obviously. This is just me sort of surmising that I think in the overall sort of strategy of it, if you sort of consider an illuminated map somewhere in the Pentagon, I think maybe your command probably see it as an extension of an offensive weapon as a part of a greater sort of strategic operational capability. But so far as Australia is concerned ourselves, no, I would say that from our perspective, it's a far more defensively orientated thing.
And do you know what allies in the region are closest with Australia?
Well, under ordinary circumstances, I would say New Zealand, but I heard you guys touch on that sort of before while sort of reconnecting, and I don't know to what degree you guys spoke about it before I jumped on, but the Ardern sort of scenario is makes it complicated because she's actually, I believe, to my understanding, other than they're in the midst of negotiating, or they have negotiated a deal in which to acquire Chinese-made vessels. So that's a bit of a warning in itself. And secondly, too, because New Zealand probably has a more hostile attitude to atomic energy than what Australia does. I don't know if you guys raised this in the chat earlier, but Ardern has basically banned the use of New Zealand ports for these new class submarines. So,
but that was a standing thing, wasn't it? That like they did that with the U.S. and then they went with some kind of ambiguity that allowed them a workaround. They said that U.S. ships could use New Zealand ports as long as they didn't have nuclear weapons, and the U.S. just said, "Yeah, fine. We never confirm or deny whether we have them on board the ships at all, and they can still come around."
Exactly. So that, I mean, in the end, we have enough shipyards and docks of our own to sort of manage, and there's nothing in sort of New Zealand's sphere that really sort of affects our ability to deploy and utilize submarines. Like in the end, if our projection is northward orientated, the ability to use New Zealand ports is probably neither here nor there. I mean, in the end, I'm not sitting in with a map in front of me and sort of Australia's sort of defence, walls of power. So I'm speaking from a pure layman's perspective. But if our orientation is towards East Asia and towards China, I would say the New Zealand thing isn't that big of a deal. However, it is demonstrative of, it's indicative of this fraying of what has been a close and cordial relationship between the two countries for a very long time. So New Zealand and Australia have historically seen themselves as quite kindred countries, and that's been very much tested with the new government that has been in power in New Zealand for the last couple of years. Hang on, I had a second point I was going to make about Ardern. I've just lost it now. Sorry. Anyway, keep going, gentlemen.
Well, are there other allies in the region other than New Zealand?
Oh, yes, that's right. Well, we've warmed towards India from a trade standpoint. So I think we sort of see India as a more amenable and a more closely sort of ideologically oriented power than, say, China. And as you guys know from what I've mentioned, say, on Patriarch's channel and the stuff I've said with AA on his channel, Australia has very much had the how should I say, Chinese talon sort of buried into its flesh. And so it's sort of India as a way out of that inexorably intertwined relationship with China, that sort of economic interdependency, which a lot of Australians are quite wary of. Secondly, in Asia specifically, probably Singapore, maybe Thailand. We have quite historical sort of ties with from a trade and a tourism standpoint, and to some degree a military standpoint. In the past, Singapore and Australia have done maneuvers together, and a lot of Singaporean sort of relationships with China and via China Singapore relationships have been quite extensive for a long time, be they commercial, be they military. But sort of Singapore finds itself very much nestled inside that that sort of Indonesia, sort of China sphere. They're sort of very much more hemmed in than, say, even what Australia is. Australia is distant, but it's not sort of hemmed in the same way, whereas Singapore very much is, and Singapore is literally an island-bound nation state in that respect. I'm kind of a bit, like, for instance, if you look at other countries, Vietnam obviously has that sort of communistic leaning, even though them and China have been hostile in the past. Vietnam does obviously lean that way. Myanmar's essentially military dictatorship, which doesn't have any friends in the West. the Philippines, as we know, is a bit of a mixed bag scenario with Duterte. And Malaysia is probably more amenable than Singapore, than Indonesia. But those countries tend to sort of pursue their own interests from certainly an economic and just a geopolitical, geostrategic standpoint.
Well, I'm glad to hear both of your perspectives on that, gentlemen. I think from the perspective of the United States, I think that this is very much in line with sort of the offensive realist perspective, with perhaps a dash of what AFK or Gnaski was saying back in the 1940s and 50s about the concept known as power transition theory, which is the idea of when a rising hegemon meets sort of that threshold to get to a point to challenge the existing geopolitical or strategic primacy of the region. The likelihood of conflict increases unless it is mitigated by either an increase in force or sort of economic or diplomatic means to de-escalate. And I think that this recent announcement, of course, is to, one, make up for the sort of diplomatic and strategic failures that come out of Afghanistan and its perception of credibility in the allies. We've had Australia criticize Biden for that. We had, the United Kingdom criticize it, even to a point where Blair was calling it imbecilic. The Dark Lord is always present, as AA would like to say. But I think it's an offensive position from the United States because the increased talk of conflict over Taiwan, the position that China will one day have its position over the world, the long-standing view, even back as far back as like congressional research, service documents from 2006, saying that China's geostrategic goals in the area as well as globally were to be seen as sort of the middle kingdom once again. Middle being, of course, like that very geocentric view of the world being the center of attention, the place where all things go through. I think at the end of the day that this is very much an offensive response into which, America is trying to reposture itself and retrench. They see that this is a long consequence, I think, of the Obama administration's pivot to Asia at the end of Obama's first term in 2011. And I think that has been the sort of intent of American foreign policy ever since then. To this day, I say that that's the one good thing that Obama did in his time in office was the pivot to Asia. And I think that we're kind of seeing the lines get drawn in maintaining this sort of policy of geostrategic containment between South Korea, Japan, and now, of course, recently with Australia. I think that this will allow Australia, like you had said, Furious, to continue to pursue a more defensive posture, especially when it comes to the issue of trade, geographically speaking, because the People's Liberation Navy has got around 66 submarines of both nuclear-powered as well as traditional diesel and diesel-electric submarines. So I think that you're right that from the Australian perspective, this is defensive, but I think that this reinforces the long-standing American strategy of geostrategic containment.
And I'd add in the business from Morgoth, where he was talking about the elephant and the whale. The classic way to look at that, and we've talked about it before. Prudential is certainly, the naval powers versus the land powers and the Mackinder stuff. Well, now the big, if you look at it like a three-legged stool, there's the Russia. There's Russia and China, and they're great land powers, and they're in the Eurasian heartland. And they're nestled right up against each other. And the classic counter position to Sparta is Athens and sea power. And of course, that's always been the North Atlantic riff, that they jam, that they play. It's the whole Athenian position of the mighty Navy. And so that policy of containment that you're talking about has to do with naval force projection. And with the UK back in on the game and the US too, and Australia looking like they're going to come in to a certain extent, it could be very, very interesting. And in terms of public opinion about what gets done with the Australian submarines, the bottom line is that they're not going to know. So, there's going to be that's going to leave a great deal of flexibility for the Australians to do things that would otherwise cause them problems, because unless they happen to, send missiles out of the tubes and attack something, the public's never going to know where they are anyway. So, Yeah, I see more of the Athenian arrangement, or what Morgoth would call the whale, and more of this focus on containment, but it has to do with naval power, because it's going to have to grow um, as a counter position against the Mackinder heartland, Eurasian landmass power arrangement that we're seeing emerge.
Yeah, and I mean this still shows the long-standing influence of Alfred T. Mayer over now 100 years ago about the influence of sea power on empire. I still think that maintains sort of the Anglosphere's naval positioning, and even more, and it has been updated, of course, recently, as you just mentioned, Semiogogue. Because as it's been pointed out, I mean, even Trump talked about it with his advisors. That's been leaked now to the press, that his position on Taiwan was like, listen, the Chinese are going to be there almost instantly. Like, what can we do about it? Like, about putting boots on the ground. So I think that the focus, especially for the United States in this agreement, is going to be about maintaining naval supremacy. Because in this region, especially given the geographic distance between getting American forces over there, between what's already on the ground and reinforcing them and supply lines, it would be better if any engagement or hot war were to occur, heaven forbid, that you sort of duke it out in a traditional ship-to-ship combat sense and go from there, because I think that observation is absolutely correct. Having the elephant try and cross the sea is not going to go well when you can have the whale.
Quite. There's almost it's funny because Semiogogue mentioned Athens and Sparta. You kind of have this Delian League kind of situation occurring with America and its Pacific allies. And just to I can't remember who said it, was it Jacaranda or someone else in the chat. I mean, yes, obviously Japan and to an extension South Korea and Taiwan are allies too, but I was more focusing specifically on Asia and Southeast Asia, but of course they're allies as well. On that basis, on that topic, we are actually seeing a relatively strong trend towards rearmament in Japan as well. Them revoking, is it their Article 7, which is their self-defense sort of stipulation? I can't remember which one it is exactly. Article 9, Article 7 of their constitution, and the Japanese just recently have partaken in the largest military maneuvers since the end of the Cold War. And the Japanese are basically planning to put carriers into the sea for the first time since the end of World War II. So there's definitely an effort by, shall I say, the non-Chinese powers and more sort of Western-aligned allies in Asia to sort of present a united front in that context. Article 6, thank you, Jacaranda.
It's Article 9 of Japan's constitution.
Article 9, okay.
It's pacifist constitution.
Yeah.
Shinzo Abe, before stepping down from office, had been pushing incredibly hard, spending most of his political capital on trying to amend that part of the constitution to allow offensive operations rather than this self-defense aspect, which is its workaround from having a standing military. Even though Prime Minister Suga will be stepping down, he'll be at this Quads meeting. I think whoever is to replace him, and most likely the Liberal Democratic Party, will win this election in the same way that sort of the PRI in Mexico dominates Mexican elections most of the time, historically speaking. That we will most likely see AUKUS play a major role in the Japanese election, especially for LDP leadership. And there are 4 people in the running, so I would imagine a hardline military position may definitely come out of the Japanese from this announcement.
They got a bunch of submarines and a new
do.
class of them, the Taigei or whatever. That's they've just gotten the first of them out. So yeah. Japan, and they just had didn't their recent exercise involve the civilian population as well?
I believe so, but I'd have to confirm.
Yeah, same.
Right.
But I know it was very extensive in size. It was by recent history standards that were very large. The largest since the Cold War, which is indicative of what the Japanese were probably trying to signal with that.
Banzai!
But yes, it did include the civilian population. They had ground forces nationwide in the country involving all of its units. So they had over 100,000 of its self-defense personnel engaged in this, on top of naval drills. And I mean, like I had mentioned at the beginning of the stream, their Deputy Minister of Defense had stated that they are ready to go to challenge Chinese naval supremacy. They will defend Taiwan as well as other Japanese interests if anything were to occur. So, I mean, this drill, I think, is definitely a strong counter signal to what's happened. And I think that this AUKUS agreement is only going to reinforce the Japanese position on it flexing its military might.
Yeah, and they've got two of these Izumo class carriers that they call helicopter destroyers. But it seems, I'm no expert on this, people who are more into it in the chat can contradict me if I'm wrong, but it appears that they can pretty much immediately be converted into what they're calling here a light carrier configuration to carry the F-35Bs. And it looks like VSTOL, so I'm guessing that's vertical, whatever, takeoff and landing. So it looks like they essentially have two aircraft carriers, two light carriers that could be, switched out to that function more or less immediately that are already in the water.
Yeah, I think the nomenclature they use is a multi-purpose destroyer, which essentially, it's described as a helicopter carrier, but their conversion is relatively straightforward, which is, I guess you could say that the Japanese have planned ahead in that regard. And also, just 2 points. One, it's not too dissimilar a policy to what has occurred in the past, where, for instance, in say World War II, Malta and to a lesser extent Sardinia were used this way. Sort of the island of Crete was used this way as well. Is that an island in some ways is an unsinkable carrier, and that is true to some degree of Japan itself. And in the instance of any aggressive moves by China of Taiwan, someone actually mentioned that Taiwan is basically our lifeline for semiconductor production in Taipei, and that is why sort of a policy and a strategy towards defending Taiwan is obviously of fundamental importance to this entire Pacific defensive network. And that being said, this is where the Japanese situation, or the Japanese mindset, the Japanese capability is so important, because essentially the one country of closest proximity who's able to react in the instance of any Chinese aggression would obviously be Japan, who would be able to respond and react with the most sort of rapidity and the most decisively within a short space of time.
Yeah, and of course Taiwan is very, very important, as Tim is always hammering on, because of this idea of the one China policy. He's always encouraged me to take that thing and turn it inside out and think about it for a minute. Because the Kuomintang government, as I'm sure you know, split and headed off there. And whether or not that particular party still is connected to its roots is a separate question. But the general point about a one China policy and a parallel world existing in Taiwan is that, for example, if the mainland government were decapitated in some sense, the closest... So it's like pulling blood out into a syringe to like mix it with the heroin and then boot it back in. They've got Taiwan there, which could become the new brain of the animal if it got swapped out. So that's another reason why I would see them being completely unwilling, just leaving aside the geostrategic aspects of the island and its importance and the difficulty in navigating the waters much of the year and blah, blah, blah. I would imagine they'd be very much disinclined to let it go.
Correct. And also there's an economic sort of advantage for China integrating Taiwan, access to more sea territories in terms of trade and resource acquisition. The other thing is to really provide the Chinese with the ability to project into the wider Pacific by taking Taiwan, having been occupied, as you say, by the sort of the remnant Kuomintang old nationalist China government of sort of Chiang Kai-shek legacy. It really has hemmed in sort of China territorially from a sea and naval standpoint, and then of course there's the aforementioned semiconductor industry, which the Chinese would obviously covet. Not so much that they require more capacity for production, but it really would put a dent in our Western capacity to access semiconductors that aren't produced by an ideological adversary. So in this sense, Taiwan is very much a keystone in this entire geostrategic question in the Pacific for a plethora of reasons, be they strategic, be they economic, trade-based. There's Taiwan. I have a feeling that with the exception of Hong Kong, which is, I think Hong Kong is, there's a lot that's different about it, but I have a small, cynical part of me has this small inkling that Hong Kong was kind of like a trial for China as to how they would leapfrog their way, further into sort of Asian territories. And even though the British obviously gave it up in '97 as a result of a treaty obligation, which ironically was signed, not with the communist government, but the British acknowledged the treaty nonetheless. China sort of has a blueprint now. The PRC has a blueprint as to how to, how should I say, jump from one stepping stone from the other strategically, and for them, their next big target is obviously Taiwan in that sense.
Yeah, and I mean, the Japanese have been their interest in defending Taiwan, both for semiconductor production, the same way that it is for Australia. Japan has a similar vested interest along with their own domestic production, especially because Japan in this area is capable of producing independently their own submarines, even if they are diesel electric powered and non-nuclear. The other thing I think that is important to consider is that we were talking about this earlier about sort of the Americanization of armaments and vehicles. Is that along with Australia being a membered deal of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, is that Japan has been pushing to become a full-fledged member customer since Turkey had pulled out in, I believe, 2019. And since then, Japan has been pushing to do so. There was a deal proposed in 2020 about this, although it would still be left up to an act of Congress to confirm the deal, that they would have a $23.11 billion sale of 105 F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft, in addition to the 42 F-35As already ordered. This would be the second largest foreign military sale by the United States, but it still needs congressional approval. But I do think that says a lot about this sort of offensive military arrangement that is innately American. I know that there was some commentary about this on Twitter I was reading from some pundits and scholars that this is somewhat innately Anglo because of its naval focus, but the technology is clearly backed by the American military-industrial complex.
Just another standpoint, just because I saw it in chat. It is interesting the nomenclature that the Japanese have been utilizing for some of their new ships in their fleet. For instance, we mentioned the helicopter the multi-purpose destroyers or the helicopter carriers are the Japanese called them the Izumo class, and the Izumo class was I think it was a class destroyer from approximately the First World War, and one of the new ones that they're building presently is the Kaga, which was a class of carrier from just prior to the Second World War. So it's funny how the Japanese sort of harking back to this old naval terminology and their class names, which harken back to, you might say, the zenith of the IGN, which is interesting. It definitely sort of signals some profound change of attitude from Japan.
Semiogogue, any thoughts?
No, I just noticed that they have one of these submarines that they've launched that runs on lithium-ion batteries. So they're cunningly coming up with ways to keep them quiet. That's for sure. And as I observed in the chat, they don't have to go as far to carry a real punch as regards mainland China. So
range is less of consideration for them. It's not like they're trying to chuff out from Hawaii to sort of get there.
Yeah, there's definitely that. So, just I guess in terms of the background for everything, my call is that Ardern can't last. I know I'm ridiculously optimistic. I'll probably be proven wrong, but I just have the whole idea of the Five Eyes having to come back together again, and the importance of the continental shelf that New Zealand is looking like it's going to make a play to claim. If those resources are made available via subversion and, usurpation and all the rest of the Chinese games to China, that would be a real problem. And, the defense aspect is probably less so, but it's still an important island. in some respects anyway. So I tend to think that my odd prognostication is that things are not going to be allowed to continue quite as they're going in New Zealand forever. And I would also say it's important to keep an eye on the Philippines to see what happens, not because of the Philippine military is in any sense important. They don't seem to have much of one that would be useful for anything other than sort of dealing with their own domestic issues. But there are just so many damned islands, like thousands and thousands of islands in the archipelago. And when you start looking at other ways to do things to get out of the South China Sea, if you're not going to go through the Straits of Malacca or whatever, then the Philippines becomes increasingly important. So I'd keep my eye on that to see what happens. And I'd keep my eyes on Vietnam, which is increasingly economically important, which has a very, very large military that's quite capable, as we discussed earlier with the stuff in the 70s Prudentialist. I'd keep an eye on that too, but obviously it's going to take some changes in the West before Vietnam would ever consider changing its position. And then there's that whole background that we just talked about, which is the idea that China may well be dealing with all sorts of problems internally, domestically, and, anything could happen. Really anything could happen. And, we might not even hear about half of it as it begins to unfold, which means that we would likely be taken very much by surprise in terms of news that could come out of there at any minute, because it's not like we would see it coming from miles away. Any indicators of problems would be tamped down and camouflaged as much as they could possibly manage. So I'm not saying that I'm in any position to be certain about their state, and I'm not an expert on China by any stretch, but it would not surprise me to hear surprising news out of there, and it could happen at any time.
Yeah, and one thing that I completely didn't even think didn't cross my mind when examining this deal was, of course, the fact that there are various Islamist groups throughout the region that could definitely play a role in sort of that old-fashioned Syrian and Iraq style of things, of funding certain groups with State Department money to fight other groups with CIA money. But that is also something to consider about piracy, as well as Islamists in the region, especially where the Vincent group is already currently positioned. But you're right that we aren't always going to know what might happen next. This is a relatively recent deal. But as we get close to the 2-hour mark, I did want to share some memes on this that Furious was so kind to send our way. So let me go share them so we can all have a good laugh as we wrap up. So here's the first one. The AUKUS, a pact to counter China. China has condemned the agreement as extremely irresponsible, and the pact has also created a row with France.
Oh no, sacre bleu!
Ah, mon Dieu!
Oh no, l'Australie have betrayed us and sided with the Americans. Oh no.
And then the other one that Furious sent me, and then we'll have final thoughts and super chats. So this was the other one that I absolutely love, because I'm a fan of political caricature, and Ardern just seems so perfect with her overbite.
Yes. As soon as I saw that, I just thought, because I actually shared something about Ardern a couple of days ago. It was like, oh, we shared the whole physiognomy never lies kind of thing. Just the cartoonist got the features perfect here, and like she's literally dressed as one of those sort of 70s, 80s hippies and little Chinese bandana, ticked all the boxes. The peace symbol and everything. And as much as we might talk about how AUKUS and our country is a sort of neoliberal neocon, and we talk about the cathedral and the expansion of the projection of sort of globo home around the world. There is sort of this truism that exists in this cartoon where sort of Ardern is this sort of immature, sort of stunted, deluded left-wing sort of hippie remnant of the left. You might say, because for those in the chat who don't know, she did her cut her master under the Dark Lord himself. She lived and worked in Britain for I think nearly 10 years. So she did her apprenticeship under the tutelage of one of the best. But her interpretation is rather even more left-wing than even Tony Blair's. So make of that what you will. But I thought this cartoon did represent that rather succinctly, which a good cartoon should.
Yeah, I thought that it was pretty darn funny there. Let me go. Someone asked for the link to it, so I'm going to send them the tweet link that you had sent me. But with all that being said, gentlemen, what are your final thoughts on this recent agreement?
I think I just threw mine out. So to save you time, keep your eye on the Philippines. Something is going to happen there. I don't think Vietnam will be allowed forever to remain in China's grasp, but that's a long-term or late midterm kind of change that you might see. But I'd keep an eye on New Zealand because Ardern can't last forever. All it's going to take is a state-level intelligence agency to care more about bringing her down than the Chinese care about keeping her propped up, and she's gone. So yeah, keep an eye on the Philippines, keep an eye on New Zealand, and remember the whole thing with the Athenians and the Spartans.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing, Semiogogue. I wish I jumped on a little bit earlier because that Athens versus Sparta analogy works really well in this context. That the obviously land-based power versus the sort of hegemonic naval power. It's definitely an interesting dynamic that applies to the Pacific. Yes, a part of me will have to rewatch your stream as well. Just on final thoughts for my credentials, I ought to apologize both to you guys and the audience. I had a bunch of technical issues, and also I as a time difference thing, I actually did get my wires crossed. And also, for those who don't know, I'm actually not. I'm actually out in the country, so I had to improvise with my connection today. I'm literally hotspotting off a farm vehicle with a big antenna, and so I've literally got like a tractor sitting outside of my house. So yes, because I'm visiting my family. I'm not in the city, so I had to do some sort of outback jack improvisation. So my apologies.
That is probably that's the coolest thing ever, that you had to pull up a damn tractor with an antenna. I can see you with like muddy boots pulling it up next to the house and then breaking out your farm data laptop to make this happen.
Indeed.
Well, we're certainly happy that you managed to show up. So thank you. But with that, I guess for my final thoughts to just round it all up before we go to super chats is that I think that this is a sign of American retrenchment. This is the long-standing continuation of Obama's pivot to Asia and sort of a reputational countersignal to the Chinese about our position and strength in the world. I think that we are seeing a return to the Anglospheric, Anglo-centric view of naval supremacy. There are many that say that this is definitely sort of a UK thing in the idea and its tradition, and I'm inclined to agree with it, despite its Americanized technology. Although, like, I do agree with Semiogogue, though, that there's still a lot that we may not know as this deal unfolds. Like we mentioned at the beginning of the stream, the Quads meeting is going to happen next week. So there's so much on the table.
Just since you've mentioned that, Prudentials, I think exactly you've sort of hit onto something quite true there, because we're obviously living in this sort of post-Brexit reality, and I think the British have been, when I say the British, to some degree the electorate, to some degree the government, and we all have opinions on Boris Johnson and how ineffectual or whatever compromise, whatever sort of words you want to throw out there about him and the Tory government that's in power presently. But there has been an inkling, partially from the government, partially from the populace as well, who've wanted to engage with the world on their own terms as a sovereign Britain, not as a nation integrated within the European Union and amongst these European agreements. Secondly, an orientation with the Commonwealth, rather than just being a sports contest held every 4 years as like a mini Olympics, to actually have the Commonwealth mean something more. And on this topic, obviously from a defense military standpoint. And then thirdly, this sort of cooperation between, in this obvious instance, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia, which sort of almost harkens back to a World War II style banding together of countries that share a very strong and historical kinship and have done so for the last century. I don't know whether you guys have reflected on this before I managed to get on, but to what degree this is a projection of global homo, or whether it's a projection of the liberal idea, that's another thing, sort of like potentially a part two or another conversation to be had. But at the very least, there is this sort of historical kind of understanding amongst our countries, and rather than sort of engaging in hostility, such as New Zealand has, for instance, we're actually in a world that's becoming more uncertain. There is this sort of solidifying of the relationship to some degree that is heartening. It's just we can only hope that they're projecting something good rather than something evil. But I guess we'll find out in due course.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that has been going on for a while. This sort of liberal hegemony, which has been sort of the primacy of sort of American-centric, or those that focus for that unipolar perspective since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So, but again, there's so much to come. I think that what you've seen here for the last 2 hours has been our initial reactions to it based on what we know and the available data of deployments and armaments. So we will most likely revisit this subject in the future. So much is still yet to be seen, and who knows?
Can I add one last point, Prudential?
By all means, get the last word and go for it.
I did send this in the private chat. I sent it to you in the PM. But one thing to mention, because I actually don't know because what I did pull up was an older document from about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. But it is interesting that with the whole Putin, Russia, phantom boogie monster kind of mindset that our media has, Australia doesn't sell uranium to Russia, and we've had a limit on that for a very long time. We sort of barred ourselves from exporting to Russia, but we went through a period of time where we were actually selling uranium to China. So make of that what you will. For some reason we sort of found China a more palatable trade partner than Russia.
Oh, Australia's asshole.
Based.
But with that, there's a couple of super chats here that I'll quickly run through, and we'll
Let's do it.
We'll wrap up there. So the first one was from Charlemagne this evening for $2. He had said, "My friend just asked if the Prudentialist was me. I'm glad that meme is never going to die between Turnip, Charlemagne, and myself." That's great. Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker for $5 says, "This week's Frog of the Week, the French, known for their underage mating calls and preference for mating with darker species, this frog is not going to make it."
Oh, Lord.
Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker again for $5. He says, "The first Chinese carriers were based off scrapped Australian carriers that were stolen from a scrapyard. The CCP is sneaky like that." I can't say that I'm surprised. Something that a lot of our commentators and I've said, and people like BAP have said, that China is a very imitative country when it comes to its military technology. I can't say I'm surprised.
One thing I will say... Oh, sorry, go, Semiogogue.
I was just going to say, I'm surprised that that subversive fucker Cringewalker is in here. Lock your doors, ladies and gentlemen.
Oof. Yeah, what I was going to say is the last carrier I believe Australia operated was in the 70s and was the HMAS Melbourne. But I'm not exactly an expert on Australian naval history, but I believe we did have a carrier that might have been, like say, surplus to requirements for from one of our allies, be it the United Kingdom or America. But we did decommission that after the Vietnam War, and we haven't had a carrier since. So. Yes, it wouldn't surprise me if the Chinese have like you say, scrapped or recovered from scrap and adopted and utilized for their own benefit. That wouldn't be remotely surprising.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised either, considering how imitative they have been in tech, and relying on old scrapped technology. I think kind of shows a sign that China's been trying so quickly to ramp up their own domestic production.
Indeed.
Charlemagne sent another one for $2. He says, "A second friend asked him, 'Isn't that you?'" I'm gonna have to get like a voice changer or something at this point.
Would be hilarious Prudential is like if AA ever hosted like a CS or a UO and just had the three of you on at the same time. I'd blow everyone's mind.
I mean, Semiogogue kind of did that already. We had Turnip, myself, and Charlemagne on the 9th talking about the recent mandates, and that was one of the comments, which I thought was funny. To a point, but although, to give a little teaser, that stream that Semiogogue hosted was recently referenced in Bournebrook magazine about the based draft, and there'll be a video next week about it.
Interesting.
Bournebrook magazine?
Yeah, a gentleman by the name of Alexander Adams referenced your stream. Yeah.
I've heard him. I've heard him several times on Pharaoh's art streams. He's a bright guy and very very interesting points of view. And I can't recommend Pharaoh's channel enough either.
Yeah, I've learned a lot between Pharaoh and then the recent deep lore stuff on art. It's very enriching. Stay in these circles, and it'll help your brain.
And I would be remiss, sorry, just very, very
Go for
fast.
it.
Everybody has to check out D talking about Warhol. If I did not give props to that man who abuses me by calling me Celeborn or Celeborn or whatever, I'd be remiss. So definitely check out the D for the art lore as well. If you do follow his art Twitter account, though, don't you dare say anything about his selections, or he will put his boot right in your ass.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't recommend D, especially the recent Warhol stuff. Warhol's been an interesting character to learn about, and I appreciate D and AA doing all the work for it.
And D's an ornament to our community, irrespective.
Absolutely. He's a pillar. Chris Raposo says for $5 Canadian. I'm so sorry that you live in Canada, but that's okay. He says, great stream. I'll need to rewatch tomorrow, but time for bed. Everyone have a good evening and good weekend. Well, Chris, when you watch this later, I know that you're going on a early morning hunt. I hope that you do have a good evening and weekend. And then last but not least, your Conoranda Plus for $5. I believe that's Australian. ScoMo will forever be remembered for crapping himself in the Engadine Makis. I wish I could understand what that's in reference to.
I was going to say, just for you wonderful Americans in the chat, Macca's is what we call McDonald's because Australians never pronounce a word completely. So yes, I actually don't understand the reference either, but yeah, something to do about shitting himself in a McDonald's. And yes, Jack Aranda is actually a fellow Aussie, and he's a cracking bloke. Actually, he was on with myself and Lady of Charlotte when we did our last stream about Australia on UO. So another up and comer who's a wonderful chap, shall I say? Good bloke.
Wonderful. Well, that wraps it up on the super chat stuff. So just to leave it at there, gentlemen, do you have anything that you'd like to shill?
I just want to thank you for having me on, and good to talk with you and with the Furious.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I don't have much aside from the fact that I suppose between the three of us, we're still trying to brew up that strategic series that we're still flinging some ideas around. So that'll be interesting once we get to it. I suppose we just have to do a plan for it and how we're going to do it. But that remains interesting because I know guys in our sphere do like these kind of discussions. And the second thing is, I know I did mention before, but again, my sincerest apologies. I just, just my situation, I had to sort of go out bush last minute. My father was a worker short, and there's a work on site he provides quite comprehensively today. But I am very thankful to the chat for being patient, and obviously with my fellow the Prudentialists and Semiogogue holding the fort whilst I was here. Not yet, that I'm grateful for. And I suppose I don't have anything myself to really shield personally, but thank you all for watching. These discussions are always enlightening and very appealing and good fun to partake in. So until next time, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you guys for having me on. Much appreciated.
Well, Furious, you're kind of streaming with the assistance of a tractor. I don't think that the apologies are in order. We kind of understand. I live out in the middle of nowhere, so I can definitely relate. But to end it all here, Bolero says for $4.99 USD, he says, here's some real money, USD Uber Alice. Yeah, but USD Uber Alice until the money printer stops going, and then things really go to shit, doesn't it? But to end it all up, I will see you all, ladies and gentlemen, on Sunday. We'll be covering U.S.-Mexico relations and the foreign policy of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So there'll be a lot for you all to learn there, and we'll have a Mexican Frog of the Week. If you are not following Furious on Twitter, his Twitter handle is below in the description. And if you are not already subscribed to Semiogogue, you Philistines, do so right now. His channel link is in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, ladies and gentlemen. Take care and be prudent, everybody.